Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that has really resonated through centuries of music. What happens when words and music meet? We've got a fascinating stack of material that gets right to the heart of this, well, complex relationship.
It's a truly rich area, absolutely. And, as our sources show, this isn't just about personal taste. The way words and music fuse together touches on really fundamental aspects of how we perceive, how we understand, and how we're emotionally moved by both, especially when they combine to, say, tell a story.
Exactly. And while music on its own is, of course, a huge philosophical topic, our material points out that music with language has actually been the dominant force through a lot of Western history. So this deep dive, we'll be focusing mainly on those Western traditions, particularly how opera and related forms have grappled with this union, really starting around the late Renaissance.
Yeah, that historical context is crucial. The material we have highlights two really big things happening around them that shaped this relationship significantly. First, you've got the actual birth of opera, a very conscious effort to merge drama and music in a new way.
Okay.
And second, the Counter-Reformation. This period of major religious reform within the Catholic Church had a direct impact on how music was supposed to function.
Okay. So our mission today, then, is to unpack the core philosophical ideas that come out of this combination. We're going to delve into the debates about, how well we can even understand sung words, how music might represent stories or ideas, and the inherent differences and sometimes, tensions between music and literary or dramatic arts. Okay, let's get into it, maybe starting with the Counter-Reformation.
Sounds good. The Counter-Reformation, as the material explains, was essentially the Catholic Church's reaction to the Protestant Reformation. It was a big push for internal reform. And a really key part of this, discussed at the Council of Trent, that was between 1545 and 1563, concerned the music used in church services. The main issue: clarity, the words.
The worry was that the music had just gotten too complex, maybe too ornate, as some sources put it. All those interwoven melodic lines.
Polyphony, exactly.
Right, polyphony. And the actual religious text was just getting lost in it all. It was becoming, basically impossible for people in the pews to clearly hear and understand the meaning of the words. And those words were the whole point, weren't they? The religious message.
Precisely. The Counter-Reformation really brought this tension to the surface. Can music serve both spiritual meaning and artistic complexity, or does one have to give way?
So that brings us maybe to monophony versus polyphony.
Yeah, good distinction. Monophony, broadly, is just one single melody. Think of someone singing a simple tune, maybe with some basic chords underneath. Still basically monophonic in that broader sense.
Okay.
Polyphony, though, in the specific sense that worried the council, involves multiple independent melodies all happening at the same time.
Our material uses a great analogy for this. Like, imagine 5 people all reciting, say, the Gettysburg Address simultaneously, but all at different speeds, maybe living phrases.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of that density, the overlapping lines in late Renaissance church music. You might have different voices singing different words, or one voice stretching a single syllable over tons of notes. It just muddied the text.
So the Council of Trent stepped in and said, essentially, music has to serve the text. Composers needed to make the words understandable, prioritize clarity.
And initially, they even seriously considered, believe it or not, just abolishing polyphony altogether, going back to the much simpler single-line Gregorian chant.
Wow. But thankfully for music history, they found a middle ground.
They did. A compromise was reached. Composers were told, basically, simplify your polyphony, pay more attention to the natural rhythm, the cadence of speech. The idea was to sort of represent human speech musically, make the words clear, but still keep it musically interesting.
Okay, so that's the church's angle. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Florentine Camerata around the same time, right?
Exactly, late 16th century Florence. And interestingly, this group of intellectuals, poets, musicians, they shared a similar criticism of complex polyphony making words hard to understand. But their goal was quite different from the council's.
They weren't reforming the church, they were trying to revive something.
They were trying to revive what they believed was the performance style of ancient Greek drama.
Ah, okay. And they were influenced by the classical thinkers, Plato, Aristotle.
They believed, based on those writings, that ancient Greek music had this incredibly profound emotional impact on its listeners, something they felt contemporary polyphony, with all its complexity, had completely lost. They thought that intricate music obscured the raw emotion.
Was their picture of Greek music totally accurate, though? Or maybe a bit of wishful thinking?
Oh, there was definitely some interpretation, maybe romanticizing going on, but the idea was powerful. So the Camerata also stressed representing the human speaking voice in music.
But their solution was different from the council's moderated polyphony.
Very different. The Camerata leaned much more towards a style that was almost monody, a single vocal line, delivering the text in a speech-like rhythm and contour, but with simple harmonic accompaniment, often just chords. This harmonically accompanied declamation was all about capturing the emotion of speech.
And this led to opera.
Essentially, yes. This approach led directly to the development of what they called drama per musica drama through music. We know it as opera. It was conceived really as musical conversations representing human interactions and emotions on stage.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how both a religious movement and this artistic revivalist group, from totally different starting points, both reacted against that complex polyphony, pushing for textual clarity.
It really is. And this brings us right to what one of our sources calls the fundamental problem of opera. Because right from the get-go, opera has been kind of controversial precisely because of this challenge. How do you effectively combine music and narrative?
It's a balancing act.
A constant balancing act. This tension between musical needs and dramatic needs, it's been there since day one, and it continues to shape how we think about opera.
And the core of that challenge, as we sort of hinted at, lies in a really basic difference between how music-like, absolute music, instrumental music works, and how narrative art works.
Exactly. Absolute music often relies heavily on repetition, doesn't it? Themes come back, phrases repeat, whole sections might return. Think of the classic ABA form. That repetition gives it structure, coherence, a sense of arrival or closure.
Right, that return feels musically satisfying. But stories, like novels or plays, they generally move forward, don't they?
They tend to be linear, directional. A narrative progresses towards some kind of goal or resolution. You usually avoid just repeating big plot points, literally. There might be motifs or echoes, but the overall thrust is forward.
So you've got this inherent mismatch. Music often likes to circle back, while stories tend to push ahead. And that's the fundamental tension when you try to fuse them in opera, or really most music with text.
Absolutely. And the very first operas in that style representativo, that speech-like style you find in composers like Monteverdi, they really prioritized faithfully representing emotional speech. It was all about capturing the ups and downs, the pauses, the intensity of human expression in musical tones, basically conversations in tones.
Which sounds dramatically very powerful.
It was incredibly effective at conveying the nuances of the text, the emotions, but there was a trade-off, a heavy price, as one source puts it.
Which was?
Well, because natural speech doesn't really have built-in repeating musical forms, the music that represented it also tended to lack those closed musical structures, the ABA forms, the extended repetitions that we often find so satisfying in purely instrumental music.
So you gained dramatic immediacy, but maybe lost some of the purely musical satisfaction that comes from form and repetition.
Arguably, yes. Early opera, for all its dramatic power, largely sacrificed those inherent musical pleasures derived from formal architecture. There might be short songs or instrumental bits, sure, but the dominant mode was this continuous, speech-driven musical flow.
Okay. Then things shifted again, didn't they, with opera seria?
They did. Opera seria became the dominant form in the 18th century. Think Handel, later Mozart's early work in this style, and it represented a different kind of compromise between drama and music.
How did that work? It wasn't all speech-like.
No, it had a very clear division of labor, you could say. The plot, the action, the dialogue needed to move things forward that mostly happen in what's called secco recitative. It's very rapid speech-like singing, accompanied usually just by a harpsichord, very efficient for getting information across.
Okay, so that's the narrative engine and the music.
The emotional heart of opera seria was in the arias. These were standalone musical numbers, usually for a solo singer with the full orchestra. And this is where characters would pause the action, step outside the narrative flow, and express their feelings, often intense feelings, in these fully developed musical pieces.
And these areas often use those repeating forms, like ABA.
Very often, yes. The da capo aria, which is ABA form, sing the first section, sing a contrasting middle section, then repeat the first section. Da capo means from the head. Often with added ornamentation by the singer was the absolute staple.
So opera seria kind of compartmentalize the problem. Recitative pushes the story. Arias provide the emotional expression within satisfying, closed musical forms.
Exactly. And this solution seemed incredibly successful. It dominated for over a century. People clearly found it worked.
But as the material points out, it wasn't a perfectly stable solution, was it? Especially that da capo aria.
Right. Musically, the da capo aria is very satisfying, clear structure, return of the main idea. Dramatically, though, it started to attract criticism over time.
Why? What was the issue?
Well, the main argument was that real-life emotional expression just doesn't work like that. People don't usually feel an emotion, then a contrasting one, then snap right back to the first one exactly as before, and then hold it there for several minutes, often repeating the same words.
Yeah, you don't tend to sing your feelings in ABA form in daily life. Emotions feel more fluid, maybe less static than that structure implies.
Precisely. The prolonged, cyclical nature of the da capo aria could feel dramatically static or unnatural.
But these criticisms didn't sink opera seria initially.
Not for a long time. And the material suggests a couple of reasons why. One is the prevailing philosophical view of emotions back then, largely influenced by René Descartes.
The Cartesian view.
Yes. Descartes' theory tended to present emotions as somewhat static, distinct states. There were a limited number of basic passions, and this view perhaps made the somewhat static, prolonged expression in a da capo aria feel more plausible, or at least less problematic.
Interesting. And the other reason?
The characters themselves. Opera seria dealt mostly with mythological figures, kings, queens, ancient heroes, larger-than-life figures. Their emotions were often grand, noble, sometimes obsessive. So this highly stylized, formal way of expressing emotion in the arias perhaps felt appropriate for these elevated, non-realistic characters, like how verse sounds natural for Shakespeare's kings and queens.
Okay, that makes sense. But then thinking about emotions started to change.
It did. Towards the latter half of the 18th century, especially in Britain, you see the rise of what's called associationist psychology. This offered a very different picture of how our minds and emotions work based on the association of ideas.
Associationism. How did that differ?
Well, it basically saw consciousness as a continuous stream or train of ideas linked together by associations formed through experience. The material gives that example, like thinking of Chinese food reminds you of a friend you ate it with, which reminds you of something else related to them, maybe jury duty they mentioned. One idea triggers the next through learned connections.
Okay, a more fluid model of thought. And how did that apply to emotions?
The associationist view saw emotions quite differently from the Cartesian one. 4 key differences, really. First, they thought emotions were mostly acquired through associating experiences with pleasure or pain, not innate. Second, they seemed less distinct, more blurry, constantly shifting as new associations formed.
Less like fixed states, more like currents.
Exactly. Third, they were seen as constantly changing, not static. And fourth, they could be rapid and fleeting, not necessarily sluggish and stable like the Cartesian passions might imply.
So a much more dynamic, shifting view of emotional life.
Right. And you can see how the static, repetitive da capo aria, which fit reasonably well with the Cartesian model, might start to feel increasingly artificial or detached from human experience as this associationist view gained ground.
So this shift in psychology might have contributed to people wanting different kinds of opera, and maybe different kinds of music altogether.
The material argues precisely that. This changing understanding of emotion likely played a role in the decline of opera seria's dominance and the emergence of new operatic forms. And interestingly, also in the rise of sonata form in instrumental music around the same time.
Sonata form.
Yeah.
How did that connect?
Well, sonata form, which became the defining structure for symphonies, sonatas, chamber music in the late 18th and 19th centuries, seemed to offer a musical structure that was maybe more congruent with this dynamic associationist view of emotion.
How so? It also has an ABA-like structure, doesn't it? Exposition, development, recapitulation.
It does have that broad tripartite structure, yes, but it's different from the da capo aria in important ways. Sonata form exposition typically presents multiple themes, often contrasting in character or key. This already allows for a broader emotional canvas than the often single emotion focus of an aria's A section.
Okay, more initial ideas.
Then the development section is key. Here, those themes are broken down, varied, combined, pitted against each other. It's a much more dynamic process of exploration and transformation, reflecting that idea of shifting, developing emotional states.
And the recapitulation isn't just a literal repeat like the da capo.
Not usually. The themes return, yes, but often with modifications, and crucially, they usually all resolve into the home key, creating a sense of synthesis or resolution after the journey of the development. So while it shares that ABA pattern at a high level, sonata form's internal workings, multiple themes, dynamic development could arguably mirror the fluid, changing nature of emotions described by associationism much better than the more static da capo aria.
Interesting. So even with these developments, the basic problem of opera, the perceived absurdities, people singing conversations, the artificiality didn't just vanish for everyone.
No, not at all. For many people, opera remained inherently unnatural. This led to still more developments and reactions.
Like what?
Well, one direction was towards forms that tried to split the difference. Things like Singspiel in Germany, opera comique in France, later opera buffa in Italy. These were essentially plays with songs, meaning they kept the musically self-contained numbers, arias, duets, ensembles, but replaced the sung recitative with spoken dialogue. Think of Gilbert and Sullivan or many Broadway musicals today. That's the basic model. Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio, is a famous, serious example of Singspiel.
A kind of halfway house. But, as the material asks, is that really any less absurd if you fundamentally object to people bursting into song?
Probably not for those listeners. So for those still seeking a more integrated approach, other ideas emerged under the banner of music drama.
Okay.
One experiment mentioned is melodrama spoken text delivered over an expressive musical background. It didn't really take off as a major form on its own, but the technique survived within opera, and significantly, it became a cornerstone of film scoring.
Ah, interesting link to film.
Yeah.
But there were more influential reforms within opera itself.
Definitely. Christoph Willibald Gluck, in the mid-18th century, initiated significant reforms aimed at making opera more dramatically direct and continuous.
What did he do?
He sought to eliminate that sharp divide between recitative and aria. He got rid of the secco recitative with just harpsichord, using instead accompanied recitative, where the full orchestra provides a continuous expressive underpinning. He also shortened the arias, trying to stop them from holding up the dramatic flow excessively.
So blurring the lines, making it flow more like drama.
Exactly. Gluck's reforms pushed opera towards being through-composed, where the music unfolds more or less continuously with the drama, minimizing those clear breaks between sections. It was a big step towards music drama.
And this trajectory, this move towards integration, really culminates with Wagner, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Richard Wagner in the 19th century is seen as the master, the perfecter of fully realized music drama, as he called it.
His Ring Cycle, for instance. How did he achieve that integration?
His works are fundamentally through-composed. He largely abandoned traditional closed forms like the da capo aria. Instead, he built his massive structures using leitmotifs.
Those recurring musical themes.
Yes. Short, memorable musical phrases associated with specific characters, objects, emotions, or ideas. These leitmotifs are woven into a continuous symphonic fabric played by the orchestra, which takes on a central narrative role.
So they provide unity, but it's not simple repetition.
Precisely. The leitmotifs return constantly, but Wagner masterfully varies their harmony, rhythm, instrumentation, and context to reflect the changing dramatic situation and psychological nuances. It avoids static repetition while creating incredible coherence and depth. The orchestra essentially tells the inner story.
So, in a sense, Wagner brought things back full circle to the camerata's ideal of music serving the drama continuously.
In a way, yes, though on a vastly grander and more complex scale. But his approach solidified this idea of music drama as distinct from traditional number opera. And as our sources note, it sparked and still sparks intense debate between opera lovers who prefer those closed forms and advocates for the continuous, integrated Wagnerian model.
That fundamental tension again. Narrative drive versus musical form.
It seems to be an enduring one. Even Wagner couldn't satisfy everyone's desire for purely musical structures, while masters of closed forms like Mozart or Verdi might not always satisfy every listener's dramatic criteria.
Okay, so we've tracked how composers wrestled with making words understandable and dramatically potent in music. Let's switch focus slightly to a related question. How can music, even instrumental music, represent things, ideas, stories, images?
Right. Beyond just setting words clearly or matching their emotion, how does music itself take on representative or narrative qualities?
We know expressive properties are key. Music's ability to convey emotions that are, generally recognizable across listeners is fundamental, especially when setting a text. You match the musical mood to the word's mood.
Absolutely essential. But music can represent in other ways, too. Our sources bring up structural representation and pictorial representation.
Structural representation, that was the Mozart example.
Yes, in The Marriage of Figaro. The idea is that the overall musical structure mirrors some aspect of the narrative structure. So the opera's final resolution of all the complex interpersonal conflicts is mirrored by the music finally resolving firmly into the home key of D major. It's a correspondence, an analogy between musical structure and plot structure.
It's not the resolving conflict sounds like D major, but the musical finality matches the narrative finality.
Exactly. It's a structural analogy. And crucially, the sources argue this kind of representation is always aided. You need to know the story, the context, to grasp the analogy. You don't just hear it directly.
Okay. And pictorial representation, that sounds more literal.
It is, in a sense. It's about music depicting specific sounds or sound-making objects, often mentioned in the text or title. The sources distinguish between unaided and aided pictorial representation.
Unaided being rare.
Quite rare, they suggest. Maybe things like bird calls, like in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, which you might recognize even without the title. But even those often benefit from knowing the context.
So most pictorial representation is aided.
Far more common, yes. This is where the text or title is essential to help us hear in the music whatever it's supposed to be depicting. Think of the whirring sound of the spinning wheel in Schubert's song Gretchen am Spinnrad, or the storm in the Pastoral Symphony, or even music representing other music like Wagner depicting a 16th century Lutheran hymn within his 19th century opera The Mastersingers. The title or text guides our hearing.
Have philosophers objected to this idea of musical pictures?
Oh, yes. Some argue music can only imitate sounds, not truly represent them artistically, or that when music represents other music, it just is that music. But our sources counter this, pointing out the difference between mere copying and artistic interpretation. Wagner's hymn isn't just the hymn, it's Wagner's 19th century take on it. They also defend the idea of hearing in, comparing it to seeing in a painting. You see the paint, but you also see the depicted scene. You hear the musical sounds, but aided by context, you can also hear in the spinning wheel or the storm.
And there was also tone painting related to structural representation.
Yes, often used with Bach. It's where specific musical gestures correspond directly to specific words or concepts in the text, like a commanding theme repeated 10 times for the 10 Commandments, or melodies going up for ascended and down for descended, or maybe using an empty-sounding chord when the text talks about the rich being sent away empty.
Again, clearly aided by the text. You need the words to get the connection.
Absolutely. It's about perceiving that structural analogy, not necessarily hearing the commandments directly in the notes.
Okay, this all leads naturally into program music, doesn't it?
Oh.
The 19th century instrumental music with stories.
It does. Symphonic poems, programmatic symphonies. These were attempts to give purely instrumental music a kind of narrative or literary content explicitly outlined in a written program that came with the music.
Why did this become so popular?
Our sources suggest a few factors. Maybe a reaction against the perceived abstraction of absolute music, influenced by philosophical ideas valuing content. Also, perhaps a way to harness music's narrative and emotional power without what some saw as the absurdities of opera.
And these programs varied a lot.
Hugely. From just a suggestive title, like Brahms's Tragic Overture, which doesn't tell a story but licenses us to hear tragedy in the music, all the way to incredibly detailed narratives, like Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique.
Ah, yes, the Opium Dream Symphony.
Exactly. Berlioz provided a very specific 5-movement story about an artist's obsessive love, his opium-induced visions, a march to the scaffold, a witch's sabbath, complete with a recurring theme, the idée fixe, representing his beloved.
And Berlioz uses all these kinds of representation.
He does. Pictorial bits like the thud of the guillotine blade, structural elements reflecting the narrative, and of course powerful emotional expression, all guided by that detailed program.
But the music doesn't literally tell the story on its own.
No. As the sources emphasize, it's more like the music provides the sound images, the emotional atmosphere, and the program provides the narrative context, almost like silent film music needing the title cards.
So what about the argument that you can just enjoy program music as pure music without knowing the story?
That's a common point, often made by critics of program music. And it's true, you can often appreciate the music purely on its own terms. However, our sources argue that to fully appreciate the artwork as the composer intended it, understanding the program is often essential. Because sometimes, program music contains musical oddities, strange harmonies, abrupt shifts, unusual structures that might seem musically nonsensical unless you know the program explains them as representing a specific event or idea. Examples like Strauss's Till Eulenspiegel or parts of the Symphonie Fantastique are given. Knowing the story makes sense of the sounds.
So it's the difference between appreciating it as absolute music versus appreciating the complete artistic statement, program included.
Precisely. And this reinforces the idea that representation in music, unlike, say, a straightforward representational painting, is almost always fundamentally aided by text, title, or context. You can't really compare it directly to unaided visual representation.
Okay, one last point touched on is the emotional impact. Does adding text change how we think about music evoking real emotions?
The sources suggest it largely does. Many arguments against absolute music evoking genuine, real-life emotions as opposed to just musical emotions tend to dissolve when you add a text, especially a narrative text. The words provide the specific object and context for the emotion that the music expresses or enhances.
So texted music can arouse real emotions, like sadness or joy, related to the story being told.
That seems to be the view. It connects to the broader philosophical puzzle of how we have real emotional responses to fiction in general, why we cry at sad movies, for example. While a full argument is complex, the presence of a text makes the case for real emotional arousal by music much stronger.
Right. So to kind of wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground. We explored that whole historical back and forth about making words clear in music, from the Counter-Reformation and the birth of opera. We looked at that fundamental challenge, maybe the core problem of mixing linear stories with often cyclical music.
And we saw the different solutions attempted, from Monteverdi's speech-like style representativo, through the compromise of opera seria with its recitatives and arias, and on to Gluck's reforms and Wagner's fully integrated music drama, each trying to balance those competing demands.
We also dug into how music represents things beyond emotion, through structural analogies, through aided pictorialism, needing that text or context, and how that played out in program music where instrumental works tried to carry narrative weight, again, needing that textual guide.
And that distinction between aided and unaided representation really seems key. It helps clarify why music's way of representing is unique and often depends on its partnership with language or explicit context, unlike much visual art.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe, thinking about today. Our digital age, streaming, music videos, soundtracks everywhere, new genres constantly emerging. How are these centuries-old questions about words and music playing out now? What new problems, what new solutions or combinations are arising as we keep exploring this incredibly powerful synergy?
That's a great question to ponder. How does technology, how do contemporary art forms continue to build on or maybe react against these historical and philosophical foundations? It's definitely something to think about.
Indeed. Well, thanks for diving deep with us today.